Hey guys, how you going? This is BillyEatWorld again, and in this video we're going to take a look at something a little bit different because today is actually the 25th of April, which in Australia and New Zealand is actually a public holiday called Anzac Day, where we commemorate the landings of the first Anzac troops in the Gallipoli campaign of 1915. With that being said though, Anzac Day isn't just about the First World War, it's also a day where we stop to remember our fallen soldiers from other conflicts as well. And so what I want to do today is tell you guys another story, one that, along with Gallipoli, is etched into the memory of all Australians, which is the story of the Rats of Tobruk. So the year was 1940, and by June, the German blitzkrieg had already smashed through Poland, Scandinavia, and most of Western Europe in just a matter of months. The French had already surrendered, and British forces had been evacuated from continental Europe at the beaches of Dunkirk, leaving them stranded and without any major allies left in the region. It would be over a year before the United States would join the Allies, and what was even worse was that on the 10th of June 1940, the Italians, under the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, they joined the Axis powers as well. And even though it seemed like Great Britain's situation couldn't get any worse, this now meant that Axis forces were now also a threat to their colonial possessions in the Mediterranean and North Africa. The most valuable of these was Egypt, because whoever controlled Egypt controlled the Suez Canal, which is the doorway from the Mediterranean Sea to Asia. And the problem is that if the Suez Canal fell into German hands, Allied convoys would need to travel all the way around Africa to reach Asia, leaving them much more vulnerable to German U-boat attack. In a nutshell, what that meant was that the fall of Egypt would have probably led to the defeat of the Allies, and with the entry of the Italians into the war, the Axis powers now had a great staging ground in Italian Libya to mount an attack. And so what Britain and its Commonwealth allies like Australia decided to do instead was launch a preemptive attack and capture Libya before that happened, hoping that would be enough to deter the Axis powers from making a move. Unfortunately, as it turned out though, they were wrong, because even though the Italians in Libya didn't end up being too much trouble to deal with at first, the Germans launched a very serious counteroffensive. In fact, Hitler's response was to send one of his most capable generals, an undefeated veteran of the campaigns in Poland and France, the now famous Erwin Rommel. With Rommel came the panzer divisions of the Wehrmacht's Afrika Korps, and they were armed with modern tanks which were vastly superior to anything the British had at their disposal. And so when Rommel raced from Tripoli across the western desert of North Africa and smashed into the Allied forces, he was easily able to push them almost out of Libya back to the Egyptian border. The biggest problem that the Germans found, though, is that when you're fighting in a desert, maintaining your supply lines is really important and very difficult. And, well, the further they pushed the British back, the longer their supply lines had to stretch, literally thousands of kilometres across the desert. What they really needed was a port in the northeast of Libya, closer to the Egyptian border, and that port was at Tobruk. But as it turns out, thankfully for the Allies, even though the Germans were pushing forward, the Australian 9th Division, along with a number of British and Indian troops, had fortified Tobruk, and they were able to repulse the German advance. Now, the issue was that although they'd bloodied the nose of the Germans and given them their first defeat on land of the war, well, the Allies were now trapped. But fortunately though, even though they were surrounded, Rommel didn't have the resources to successfully capture the city at the time. So, in April 1941, the Siege of Tobruk officially began. The Germans did their best to try and get the Allies to surrender by demoralising them with propaganda, but they didn't probably realise at the time that Australians have this weird sense of humour and that we affectionately insult each other. And so when the now infamous German broadcaster Lord Haw began to tell them they were all trapped like rats, well, they just thought that was funny and the nickname stuck, and they dubbed themselves the Rats of Tobruk. The other interesting thing about the nickname is that it also describes how the Australians fought in the battle, because after repulsing German advances time and time again, they'd always counterattack straight away and steal all of their gear. And it was these raids, along with of course the efforts of the Royal Navy and the Royal Australian Navy, that kept the troops supplied and fighting for so long. Despite many efforts to break through and lift the siege earlier though, including a British armoured offensive called Operation Battle Axe, nothing actually did work. And so finally, after around 5 months, it actually got to the point that Australian forces weren't strong enough to keep fighting, and so they were eventually withdrawn and replaced by Czech and Polish troops, who held on for another 3 months. The good news is, though, the Allies did eventually end up pushing the Germans back into Libya and lifting the siege in another British offensive called Operation Crusader. But in saying that, only 6 months later, Rommel would again launch another offensive, and this time he did manage to capture Tobruk and penetrate well into Egypt. The big difference this time, though, was that enough time had passed that the USA had now joined the war, and also the Germans were locked in a titanic struggle with the Soviet Union in Russia. And what that meant was that Rommel's desert campaign wasn't really at the top of the priority list anymore, and eventually the Africa Corps' advantage would be eroded as new Allied tanks and aircraft made it to the African battlefield. The real turning point of the Western Desert Campaign, though, took place between July and November 1942 in a series of battles around another fortified Allied town in Egypt this time, called El Alamein. And it was here, on the literal brink of defeat, that the Commonwealth Allies finally succeeded in pushing back Rommel's forces, recapturing most of the territory they'd previously held, including Tobruk. In another case of unfortunate timing for the Germans, the British offensive was also joined by US forces in November 1942 when they landed in Africa in Operation Torch. And even though they didn't officially surrender until May 1943, and they did actually have a few more limited victories, like for example the Battle of Kasserine Pass, that pretty much did eliminate any chance of a German victory. So, all in all, the Siege of Tobruk might not seem like much compared to El Alamein or any of the other really big battles of the Second World War, but it obviously was an important one. Over 3,000 Australians and more than 2,000 other Commonwealth troops were killed or injured to delay the Axis forces as long as they could, and arguably that may have been the deciding factor in the North African campaign. The reason we as Australians remember this, though, is because it showed us that we, an even smaller and younger nation than we are now, could stand up to the blitzkrieg that had already conquered Europe. And we beat them through blood and sweat and sheer determination. And if that doesn't make you proud to be an Australian, well, I don't know what does.